My name is Songezo Zibi. 2021 marks 25 years since the South African Constitution came into effect in 1996. The signing ceremony for the Constitution took place on Human Rights Day, a symbolic day given the history of the Sharpeville massacre, which is a representation of the bloodletting that had formed and deformed our country's soul over the centuries. Upon the recommendation and support of Brand South Africa, I asked Judge Albie Sachs, former judge of the Constitutional Court, to reflect on how our Constitution came into being, as well as its meaning to South African life. You will shortly understand why I asked him specifically. On turning 6 years old during World War II, which was from 1939 to 1945, Albie Sachs received a card from his father expressing the wish that he would grow up to be a soldier in the fight for liberation, South Africa's liberation fight, that is. His career in human rights activism started at the age of 17, when as a second-year law student at UCT, he took part in the Defiance campaign. 3 years later, 1955, he attended the Congress of the People at Kliptown, where the Freedom Charter was adopted. Kliptown is here in Johannesburg, in Soweto. He started practice as an advocate at the Cape Bar at the tender age of 21. The bulk of his work involved defending people charged under the racist laws and repressive security laws of the time. Many people face a death sentence. He refers to this in our conversation. He calls them swingers, using parlance that was used by lawyers at the time because so many judges were inclined to dish out the death penalty. And he talks extensively and impressively to this. Judge Albie himself was raided by the security police and subjected to banning orders which restricted his movement, and eventually was placed in solitary confinement in prison without trial for 2 long spells of detention. In 1966, he went into exile. After spending 11 years studying and teaching law in the United Kingdom, he worked for a further 11 years in Mozambique as a law professor and a legal researcher. In 1988, he was blown up by a bomb placed in his car in Maputo, Mozambique by the South African security police. He lost an arm and sight in one eye. During the 1980s, he worked closely with Oliver Tambo, the leader of the ANC in exile, where he helped draft the organization's code of conduct as well as some of its statutes. After recovering from his injuries, he devoted himself full-time to preparations for a new democratic constitution for South Africa. In 1990, when various organizations, including the ANC, were unbanned, he returned home as a member of the Constitutional Committee and the NEC of the ANC, and took an active part in the negotiations which led to South Africa becoming a constitutional democracy. After the first democratic election in 1994, he was appointed by President Mandela to serve on the newly established Constitutional Court. But Judge Albie is not just a jurist, so in addition to his work on the court, he has traveled to many countries, sharing South Africa's experience of trying to heal a divided society. He has also been engaged in the sphere of art and architecture, and has played an active role in the development of the Constitutional Court building and its art collection on the site of the old Fort Prison in Johannesburg. It is a must-see. My conversation with Judge Albie took place on Sunday, 19 September 2021. He began by telling me how he prepared for our conversation.
I've spent much of today thinking back that first day. We put on our suits. I didn't sleep the night before. We're going to meet the enemy, but not with spears, guns, limpet mines, but with the weapons of constitutionalism. And I didn't sleep, and I think all of us on our side didn't sleep. And I think we all shared the same fear. A huge, deep fear. We weren't scared of the enemy. We'd been in and out of jail and prison and exile, had been blown up. That we weren't scared of. We were scared that we might give away at the conference table so much that people had fought for. We buried so many of our comrades. In my case, Ruth First and other comrades in Mozambique, a big cemetery with about 16, 17 people buried who died while I was in exile there. People had been tortured to death. We had the generation of our parents and our grandparents that fought for freedom, and now we're nervous. If we're not smart enough and principled enough and together enough, we might see things on that table that we can't kind of recover afterwards.
And this table, sorry?
Yes.
This table is the negotiations you're referring to.
It's negotiations. Yes. And I don't, I'd have to go through the archives to see physically, because then there were, I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 of us on our side, maybe 50 or 60 on the other side. And our side was the cluster of negotiators headed by the ANC team. Cyril Ramaphosa was the head of the negotiations commission, so he was like head of that team. And on the other side was the enemy team. I'm not sure at that stage if Mandela and de Klerk actually were there at the formal thing, but when the negotiations started, they weren't a party to the negotiations. And I just looked at them, and there they were, white men, elderly white men, maybe one or two women, maybe two or three people of color, but overwhelmingly white men and overwhelmingly Afrikaans speaking. Not that you can see that in their dress, but we knew that would be the position. And I looked at our side, and we were men, we were women, we were young, we were old. The women were dressed in comfortable attire. We were fairly smart. Oliver Tambo used to be quite strict. When we negotiate, when we meet the other side, even when we're speaking to the enemy, we wear a suit, the men. We're not people from the bush, and we must take ourselves seriously and dress seriously. But even within that, you saw the variety of the nation on our side, and you saw the smallness, if you like, in national terms of the people on the other side. And then we actually start the talking. And I'm smiling now, because the very first issue had nothing to do with the racism, the three presidents, F-word federalism. The very first issue we had to discuss was smoking. Should we allow smoking in the discussion rooms? And here we had factions on both sides. And I belonged to the anti-smoking faction. It hurt my eyes. I couldn't bear the idea of sitting in a room with smoke. And we had some inveterate smokers. They couldn't get through the day without smoking. Kad Asmal just totally needed to smoke when things were tense. I think Vali Musa was a heavy smoker. On the other side, well, maybe not this occasion, but F.W. de Klerk was a heavy smoker. And our first victory was not a victory for the ANC, it was a victory for the anti-smokers against the smokers. No smoking. And it sounds...
Smoking was allowed indoors. And
yes.
And the younger members of the audience might not remember, because we, of course, had legislation later on that said people could smoke indoors, but people used to smoke in buses and taxis and so on at the time.
It sounds like a small thing, and it was a small thing, but the small thing was a big thing, because we reasoned it out, and we agreed now, the smokers agreed that it would be so uncomfortable for the non-smokers, the anti-smokers, even apart from the health factors and so on, that they would have to go out to have their smoke. So that was kind of a little breakthrough. But and then, like so many things where I've been nervous, going into court, you need that tension in advance. But the minute you start, you're engaged. The energies flow. You forget that nervousness. Now we've got a fight on our hands, and it's a fight for the freedom of our country. And there was one huge central battle. There's an Argentine legal philosopher who says that every constitution has a central drama. The central drama of the 1910 racist constitution of South Africa wasn't on racism. It was how to bring together the Cape Colony that had black people on the voters' roll with the Boer republics that excluded blacks completely, how to unite what was called the white races. And all their arguments and discussions, a bit about the language question, English and Dutch, related to those issues. our central drama was on group rights, which the enemy, and even this is interesting, we started off calling the enemy. As we started talking, we softened it to the regime. The regime insisted that South Africa was a country of many different nations, and to be one country, to have franchise for everybody, they were willing to accept that. They had to accept that. The world demanded it. But it was necessary to do so on the basis of the groups to which we belonged. And the three main groups, as they saw it, would be the Afrikaners and other whites supporting the National Party, the grouping in the ANC, overwhelmingly black, and the Zulu-speaking nation community under Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And what they were aiming for was what they called consociational democracy, a country like Belgium, with the French-speaking part in the south, the Walloon country, the Dutch-speaking people in the north, the Flemish part, and territorially divided, and all the institutions of state having components based on those origins, with Brussels sharing power between them. So it's power sharing between different ethnic racial groups they had in mind. And what they wanted was three presidents governing. It would have been Mandela on Monday, de Klerk on Tuesday, Buthelezi on Wednesday. I'm exaggerating. It would have been 2 years, 2 years, 2 years.
Yes.
And they would rule by consensus, which would mean that all had to agree. And as we saw it, the kernel of that whole objective was a white minority veto. And they were using the language of minority rights to ensure that all the accumulated privileges, wealth, property achieved through the system of white supremacy would not be disturbed.
So,
And if I could just give our counter position on that, because this is the central drama, and this is why we had the breakdown later on.
yes.
The ANC position had already been worked out under Oliver Tambo in Lusaka, and he had commissioned Paulo Jordan in 1985 to draft a paper projecting into the future on what the ANC's approach should be to power sharing, and what was anticipated would be the attempts to preserve a position for the white minority. And Paulo did a magnificent paper that deserves to be held up as one of the prize features of our whole constitutional story. It's hardly known. But he said, okay, the whites are scared. They're not going to put down their guns. They're not going to relinquish power, because if there's majority rule the way they see it, they're going to be driven into the sea. Things will be done to them that they done to the black people. That's why they're hanging on to power sharing between groups. But he said, our answer is not power sharing. Our answer is a Bill of Rights. And a Bill of Rights is very deep in ANC history. In 1923, the ANC called for a Bill of Rights, focusing very much on the franchise, on education and land. In 1944, during World War II, African claims were projected. We're fighting Hitler, Mussolini, Imperial Japan, all racist community, the Axis. What about here in South Africa when the war's over? What are African claims? And African claims included a Bill of Rights. We want a Bill of Rights for all South Africans. That will restore dignity, enable us to have full franchise rights, access to the land, to education. 1955, the Freedom Charter. I happened to be there in Kliptown as the police came in on the last day, arresting us, putting our leaders on trial for treason. And we were saying South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white together. That was regarded as treason in those days. It was a very revolutionary concept. And that was a kind of a Bill of Rights. So this was in our tradition, the non-racial democratic South Africa. It was the clash between those two concepts that was the head-on collision in the negotiations.
Now, Judge Albie, what is often forgotten now, because we've got so many challenges in our country relating to poverty, inequality, continuing exclusion, whether it is in terms of spatial development, spatial planning and development, and so on, that there is often a gripe that you guys went into the negotiations and you sold out. And my retort typically is that, well, we did not have a surrender of the apartheid government at the time. There was a negotiation, and I'd like us to give us a sense of just, I guess, tactically and other strategically, how you thought, because it became a new phase of struggle in a way, how you would tackle that phase of struggle, which was the negotiation itself.
Right. I just want to add one very important aspect of the 1980s when we're envisaging the future constitutional order, and about the Bill of Rights. And I want to share this with the viewers. So the Bill of Rights then became central. It was majority rule in a united, undivided South Africa. And the whites, if they were worried, would be protected by a Bill of Rights, not because they were white, but because they were human beings. The Bill of Rights doesn't protect majorities or minorities, it protects human beings. And if you look at the great thinkers of that time, the Albert Lutulis and the Robert Sobukwes, that sense of common humanity that is so strong for African people is at the core of the idea of the Bill of Rights. But there were many of our supporters and activists who called it a Bill of Rights. They were scared that we get majority rule, and there's this Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights, protecting the property, the privileges. So already in the 1980s, I was asked now by Oliver Tambo to explain a Bill of Rights to people. And I said, a Bill of Rights can be conservative. It can freeze the status quo. But why do we hand over the Bill of Rights to conservative elements? Let's have a Bill of Rights that is emancipatory, a Bill of Rights for workers, a Bill of Rights for women, a Bill of Rights for the poor, a Bill of Rights for people who want education, who want access to health. And so we developed the notion of a Bill of Rights that would be emancipatory, that would include the three generations of human rights, the civil and political rights of Europe and America in the 18th century, the social and economic rights that came from Bismarck and the Russian Revolution and Swedish social democracy in the 20th century, the environmental and peace rights, the third generation of rights, developmental rights in the late 20th century. We want all of those. So a Bill of Rights then can be not something that prevents transformation, but a Bill of Rights that actually gives rights to the marginalized, the dispossessed, the landless, the homeless, the poor. So already that was in the back of our minds. Now we're going to the negotiations armed with these concepts, a transformatory constitution, a constitution that would bring about not only a political revolution in South Africa, but a social and cultural revolution. The problem was they had the guns, they controlled the army, they controlled the administration, and we weren't strong enough to destroy their physical administrative power. And we didn't want decades of fighting so that we would end up inheriting a ruined country and people hating each other. We wanted a country that would be functioning. That was so much the dream of the Lutulis and the Tambos and the Mandelas and so on. And they felt that, and I want to say this, Songezo, as proud Africans, they felt that the whites will never have the generosity and openness to embrace everybody. But we who've suffered so much for being who we are, we will show the world that it is possible for people of all backgrounds and languages and cultures and beliefs to live together as equals. And that wasn't a concession. That wasn't giving in to the superior firepower. That was a very affirmative, proud and powerful belief. The question was how to get there. And the early on, and I want to add one other thing that was important. I remember speaking to a conference, a seminar in Lusaka in 88. I still had two arms then. I was blown up 3 weeks later and lost my arm. And my heart's beating. I'm telling the people it was called an in-house seminar. We had people from MK, we had administrators, diplomats, some people from the underground, overwhelmingly black people. And I'm explaining why we need a Bill of Rights. And I say it makes us look good. It's our strategic answer to the minority rights. And we need a Bill of Rights against ourselves. We'd seen bad things happen in our organization. We'd seen things happen in countries that had fought heroically for freedom, and the new leaders had gone on to accumulate wealth and power for themselves, to throw opponents into jail. We didn't want that to happen in a liberated South Africa. Anyway, so this is our thinking. Our thinking is not, we're too weak, we have to please the oppressors, we have to find some way of sharing power with them. On the contrary, we have to liberate South Africa politically, imaginatively, culturally. We have to get them to lay down their arms. We have to get a new government in power that has a mandate from the people to bring about change. How to get there? And the first debates were, who writes the Constitution? And the regime said, we write the Constitution, and we put it to a referendum. And we said, nothing doing. A Constitution has to be written by people mandated by the whole nation. So that was our biggest first battle, to agree to a two-stage constitution-making process. The first stage would be a constitution to get a democratically elected parliament. We knew then now it would be completely different from those of us sitting around the table at Kudesa. It would reflect the nation in a much better way. Then they were saying, but how can we concede to simple majoritarianism? We're not going to lay down our arms. We said, we will give you certain guarantees, not because you are you, but the country we want to live in will have a Bill of Rights. We want a Bill of Rights. It will have a separation of powers. It will have free and fair elections. These are not concessions. That's the country we want to live in. So we will agree to certain principles in advance that will be binding on the new parliament. And we got that idea from Namibia. Namibia got its independence on the basis of a white paper negotiated with the United Nations that laid down certain principles. And the Constitutional Assembly will have to have a 2/3 majority, and we will have proportional representation to make sure that even the smallest groups are there. And finally, we would have a constitutional court to decide if the principles agreed to sitting round our Kudesa table have been complied with in the ultimate constitution. And if you go through, we had 34 principles, if you go through them, there is no protection of property rights as such. The interim constitution includes a kind of broad protection of property rights, right to use and property and alienate property and so on, subject to the right to take property for public purposes, subject to compensation. Fairly conservative, but that's not written into the principles for the final constitution. And the final constitution does not have a strong protection of property rights. It only protects the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of property. And that was challenged by conservative forces in the Constitutional Court, and we rejected the challenge. We said there are many constitutions in the world that don't protect property rights as such. So we didn't concede anything on that. The regime was not willing to accept our proposals. And we noticed at the same time they weren't releasing our political prisoners. It was already 1992, 2 years after the unbanning of the ANC. We still had people on Robben Island. They were going on hunger strike. We had people coming from the hostels with what were called cultural weapons, going and murdering people in the neighborhoods. And that wasn't being stopped. We had that terrible massacre at Boipatong. And there was like warfare outside. And we were seeing we weren't getting closer to the democratic ideal. And so we withdrew from negotiations. That was
Judge
the real, yeah.
On that, because I was already a teenager at that time, and I think it was after the Boipatong massacre that there was an announcement by then ANC President Nelson Mandela to say they're pulling out of the negotiations. And Many of us lost relatives. My grandfather's brother was thrown off a train on the East Rand, and he died. And there were many other things, and there were the hit squads and so on. My question is, do you think that was because it was dirty tricks? Do you think that was a negotiating tactic do you think it was to break the negotiations? Was it to gain leverage, to create a new urgency and extract concessions? In your sense, what was it? What was the drive?
Right. The overall strategy was what was called black on black violence, and to drag out the proceedings so that people would forget what they called uhuru, freedom, and say, yeah, we need the whites, a strong government to control the country. And it made it look as though black people were not Democrats. They're killing each other. There was a strong third force operating at the level of massacre, murder, but also at the propaganda level. And of course, the height of it came later on when Chris Hani was assassinated, with the very strong motive from the ultra-right wing to get a black counter-reaction. The army has to be called in to break down negotiations. I would say many different factors were involved. Overall, from the regime side, facilitating, if not actually instigating, the black on black violence. Very strong people in security cluster promoting it. And I don't want to get into particularities of political parties, but under sectors fearful of a truly democratic government, wanting to have independent states in their under their particular control, going wholeheartedly for that kind of violence. And, Songeza, we stress these points not to score points and so on, but to say this idea that somehow the negotiations were a sweetheart deal done in a smoke-filled room somewhere with a capitalist meeting Mandela and saying, okay, you can have the vote, but we keep our property, is so far from reality. We were being killed. People were being killed. I heard afterwards Max de Pree had some wonderful interviews with right-wing Afrikaners. There were 40,000 white men with guns waiting for the call from Constant Viljoen. They were so eager to seize the negotiators. They were going to take us to UNITA-controlled territory in Angola, knock our heads together. So it wasn't in a free-floating atmosphere, sweetheart deals at all. We had to do it step by step. We had to disarm even the right wing, ending up giving them the idea of a Boerenstaat one day, somehow. It required a lot of astute negotiating, and it was very rough. And we almost lost everything when Chris, our comrade, wonderful, dear comrade Chris, was killed, when the people were so enraged, and that only Mandela, that's the day Mandela became president of South Africa. Only he had the authority to really say, we must go for elections. That's the way we will, if you like, avenge Comrade Chris, through democracy, not through playing into their hands. So I'm stressing all these surrounding circumstances, which you remember so vividly, to indicate what was happening inside CODESA was extremely important. It had an intellectual side to it, but what was happening outside was, in a way, even more important. After the breakdown, Boipatong was the trigger, it wasn't the cause. The cause was a clash of two visions of the Constitution, but that was the trigger, that was the last straw, if you like. And then we had rolling mass action, hundreds of thousands of people, disciplined, organized, in the street, demanding the non-racial democracy that we eventually got. And the world saw, our people saw, organized, disciplined forces backing the position adopted by the liberation movement. And that provided a split inside the regime, the majority going along with people like Rolf Meyer, seeing there was no other way. We can't have this power sharing between groups. It's not going to work. We don't want to ethnicize our future parliament. We want to have a democratic South Africa, place and space for everybody. Our language, culture, religion will be protected, and no one will be subjected to abuse and to torture and detention without trial. Everyone will have the right to vote. We can go along with that. And the only condition they imposed at that stage, that split the ANC was to have 5 years of a government of national unity. And
first term of the democratic government was to be 5 years, which was how de Klerk ended up being, FW de Klerk ended up being the second deputy president, effectively.
Right. So it ended up, in fact, de Klerk walked out after 2 years.
Yes,
but Leslie stayed in. And for another day, I can tell the story of the role I played at the ANC NEC meeting on why we should accept the government of national unity, but we should make it subject to a mandate from the people for a program of reconstruction. And then Carter Aswell said, Comrade Albie, could be reconstruction and development. And I said, of course. So we have a government of national unity for 5 years, and we're learning on the job. Better have them inside government than outside creating mayhem. And there'll be a mandate, an electoral mandate for reconstruction and development of the country that will be binding on the new cabinet. And then we were unanimous, we could all agree to that. So it was a temporary concession. Palo Jordan to this day say we shouldn't have done it, but it gave us the wonderful first elections. Then, and maybe I can end this part by stressing, so who made the Constitution? It was not Nelson Mandela. He was right outside. He wasn't even in the Constitutional Assembly. He was the president, waiting to sign. It was 490 people made our Constitution. 490, and who were they? More than half of them had been on Robben Island. A huge number had been in exile. We had a very powerful women's group because the ANC women had been fighting, and they'd got a quota of 30% on the lists of ANC had to be women, 3 out of 10 in every sector. And strong people, Freni Jinwala was now not presiding over the Constitutional Assembly. It was Cyril Ramaphosa was presiding, and Leon Wessels was the deputy. And there was a national coalition of women outside. Freddie was saying we couldn't trust the ANC on the women's issue. We women from all different parties must get together. We had very powerful trade union representation in the Constitutional Assembly. People who had been in the worker struggles, all the different unions. And we had people from a whole range of different civics, and they were the majority group in the Constitutional Assembly. And we ended up with this progressive constitution, not because we had smart lawyers. We did have smart lawyers, but because we had progressive people who've been struggling for freedom, with freedom in their hearts and their minds. And one of the most important themes in our constitution is social and economic rights in the Bill of Rights. For people who feel human dignity is so important, the non-discrimination persecution of gays and lesbians, sexual minorities, it's in our Bill of Rights, 1996. Environmental rights in our Constitution, 1996, before it became internationally accepted as necessary. Children's rights, very strong rights for women. Women right to choose in terms of reproduction, but also freedom from violence from public or private sources. I think it's the only constitution in the world that constitutionalizes a prohibition on gender-based violence. So in terms of the document, it was a document we wrested from history and overwhelmingly African people. I mean it in the sense that we used it in those days, Black African people. And that's why it's such a strong document. But the Constitution itself doesn't build houses. It doesn't create school places. It doesn't decolonize education. It doesn't restore land. You need instruments, agencies to do that. You need the people who created the Constitution now to invoke their rights under the Constitution, to make them real, to materialize them. And that's where, to such a great extent, we've fallen short from what we wanted to achieve. But the answer is not to trample on the Constitution, but to use the Constitution that we fought so hard for. And that truly does represent the sacrifices of the people we buried and the people who never lived. When Mama Tambo got into Parliament, she's all flustered now. She's a nurse. And she says, Comrade Albie, can you help me write my first speech? And I said, no, Comrade Adelaide, you've got to write your speech, draft something, and I can help you with it. And she started off by saying, my one regret is that my late husband, Oliver, didn't, and I think she's going to say become president of South Africa. She said, my late husband, Oliver, didn't live to vote in a democratic South Africa. It was beautiful. I couldn't have said that. I wouldn't have written that. And then I said, Comrade Adelaide, speak about what you know. She was a nurse, a wonderful nurse. Speak about health. Don't try and make a fancy speech. Speak from inside yourself. In any event, that's just to indicate the situation as it was at the time.
Judge Albie, for our audience, I'm just going to bridge the history, because I'm also mindful of time, that there was CODESA, and I think the point at which we had the Boipatong massacre, and Madiba said, no more, we're not participating in this process that is also being undermined by the regime with killings of children and so on. So I remember that very well. And I think that's how we had then CODESA 1 and then later on CODESA 2. And then we had basically all the principles being agreed, and I'm summarizing, because in between we had the AWB smashing the fence at Kempton Park and getting into the building and slapping Amishan Rajbansi and other participants to try and physically break up the negotiations itself. So it was a violent time in many respects. The 1994 came. I do want, because I'm not sure how many people know this part of our history, I do want to talk about the moment in the months leading up to the election in 1994, because the negotiation process had become challenging in many respects. You had a faction with the homelands, some of the homelands, such as Bophuthatswana and KwaZulu and so on, forming the Concerned South Africans group, if you recall, and asking for South Africa to become a federation. And Constant Viljoen and his group saying that they've got 40,000 men under arms, as you said before. And the news coverage, the international news coverage, was that South Africa was about to implode in an orgy of violence, basically. And there was then a concept of sufficient consensus, because I think it became clear that if we wait for everybody to agree on everything, we will never have freedom, effectively. So we need to have sufficient consensus in the negotiation so that we can move forward. And at that juncture, there were those who held out, the Concerned South Africans group, but the Inkatha Freedom Party and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi were really instrumental in that resistance, together with the conservative wing of the regime and other. There was a party called the Conservative Party. We don't need to go into that detail. You know about it. The point I want to make is, I don't know if you know about it. There was then a last-ditch intervention just before the election. Henry Kissinger came here. Not sure whose idea that was. Maybe you can tell us. And he was accompanied by a gentleman called Washington Jalango Okumu from Kenya. And there was a negotiation. I think it was in Cape Town. It failed. And everyone was about to give up and throwing their hands in the air. And this Washington Okumu went to see Chief Buthelezi in KZN. And we ended up with the IFP being a sticker at the bottom of the ballot, of a very long ballot. Can you just give us a sense of that period and then get us into the Constitutional Assembly period after 1994?
Right. I mean, you've got a great memory for all those areas, and you're giving people some idea of the texture and all the different challenges from different sides. And we have the generals demanding amnesty, and out of which came the Truth Commission afterwards. It was another big thing. Bophuthatswana, the RVB crashed into the World Trade Center, a grandiose name, very rather mediocre buildings physically. And then they crashed into Bophuthatswana in a very clumsy attempt. In a way, did South Africa a good service, because it was so clumsy, it was put down, and the whole regime in Bophuthatswana that was siding with the regime collapsed after that. So these were some of the crises that we had to get past. The sufficient consensus was an idea that Cyril Ramaphosa came up with, because he said, we can't take votes. Then you'd have some tiny little Bantustan will have an equal vote to ANC or the government, and people will auction their votes. We need sufficient consensus for the process to move forward. And we appointed 2 judges, and one was Judge Chabot, who had the confidence of de Klerk, and the other was Ismail Mohammed, who had our confidence. He'd been part of the freedom struggle. They presided, and they would decide. And there was one vote where the IFP put forward some proposals which were not accepted. And so they objected to some other proposal, and the 2 judges ruled there was sufficient consensus, and the IFP walked out. Sufficient consensus because if the liberation movement was against a proposal, we could never move forward. If the regime that had the guns was against the proposal, totally, we could never move forward. But if those 2 were agreed, then there'd be enough support from the others for consensus to move forward. And so the IFP held out right to the end. There are lots of people claim that they were the ones who provided the final trigger that got Mangosuthu Buthelezi to climb on board. But I think myself, he never wanted to be outside of the elections, feeling that he would be totally missing out. And there were some concessions made at the last minute. The one was to give a special status to the Zulu monarchy, and to this day that's an issue that's how can I say, a lot of attention is paid to it. And the other was an agreement not to reduce the powers that the provinces had under the interim constitution in the final constitution. And that was to say, in other words, we will have at least what we've got now. And maybe I can come in on the road of the Constitutional Court at this stage, because we had to decide if the Constitution was constitutional. It's never happened in the world. You know, we South Africans, ons is baie slim. We can be very smart. And we came up with this idea that the court would now look at the principles. And we said overwhelmingly, the Constitutional Assembly drafted a constitution that complies with the separation of powers, with the Bill of Rights, with fundamental rights for everybody, with the provinces and the municipalities, local authorities having certain guaranteed powers. Not quite federalism, not a completely united country, united South Africa with federal features, with language rights protected, religious rights protected, rights for women protected, customary law recognized as an original source of law, equal to the common law, but like the common law, subject to the Constitution. The women's group fought hard for that. We don't want culture and religion to be used to elevate patriarchy so that we can be subordinated in our homes, in our workplaces, in our families, and so on. All of these things fought out at CODESA. In any event, we spent 10 days hearing arguments from different sources, challenging the text of the Constitution that had to be drafted within 2 years. They had the last vote late in the afternoon on the last day of 2 years, and I always joke that we were lucky 96 was a leap year, so they had one extra day. And they voted, and it was something like 83% voted for the most progressive constitution, with gay rights protected, with environmental rights, social and economic rights, rights for women. In that constitution got 83%, and there were some abstentions and a few voted against. In any event, we had before that decided that the text overwhelmingly complied with the principles, but in 9 respects it didn't. And amongst them, the most important one, we said ultimately at the end of the day, looking at all the changes made to the powers of the provinces, the basket on the side of fewer powers dipped, it went down. And so we declared that the Constitution was unconstitutional. Another aspect of where we declared it was unconstitutional was to remove the public protector. The principle said the public protector was one of the bodies to protect democracy, would have an entrenched right, and the draft allowed a majority in Parliament to dismiss the public protector. And we said that's not enough. Entrenched means something stronger. So now it has to be 2/3. Great relevance to what's happening today. And there were There were a few other areas like that. So we sent it back. And I still remember my former comrades in the chamber, their jaws dropped, They just thought their lawyers had said it's fine. And we said in 9 respects it didn't. But there were some criticisms of the Constitution that we rejected. And one was from the Free Market Association and the Chamber of Commerce, saying there's no property clause defending property as such. We rejected that. There was another from the business community saying that the workers' rights are protected and the rights to have unions and go on strike and collective bargaining. But if the workers have a right to go on strike, we must have a right to lock out. And we rejected that.
I remember that.
We rejected that. We said the only power the workers have is to withdraw their labor. You've got to look at these matters contextually. In any event, we sent it back to Parliament. The corrections were made. There were some other challenges, and we gave it the okay, and it was finally adopted. Signed into force of law by Nelson Mandela at Sharpeville.
Yes, I remember that.
Sharpeville, where the people had been killed, deliberately choosing that place on Human Rights Day, 1996. That's the 25th anniversary of that. We'll be celebrating later this year.
Yes. Judge Albie, there was a time with the previous public protector, when lots of people questioned why the public protector, well, let me say some people, maybe not lots of people, some people questioned why the public protector was so powerful and so on. And it was at that time that I recalled that we used to have something called an ombudsman in South Africa. In isiXhosa, where I came from, we used to call them imbutsuma. That's what our parents used to call them. And they weren't terribly useful. They were like HR in companies. They would kind of purport to listen to you, but not really solve your problem. And it was the ANC that insisted on a powerful public protector's office that would have the kind of powers that it had. I'm just not sure now whether that was in Ready to Govern. But I'm using that to lead on to a discussion about an array of institutions that we now have, some of them under Chapter 9 of the Constitution and others outside of Chapter 9 that relate to institutions that it was decided needed to be independent. The Auditor General was one such example of an institution. You had the Public Protector, you had the Auditor General, we have the South African Reserve Bank and so on. Can you just give us a sense, Judge Albie, of why it is in a democracy where you otherwise have majority rule, and if you all put up our hands and we say, no, this is what we want now, why do you need independent institutions still that are seemingly a law unto themselves?
That's the exact point. That's their virtue, their strength, that they're not running for office. They're not campaigning. They're the ones who ensure the integrity of our institutions. So you could have mentioned the Independent Electoral Commission, the Judicial Service Commission. These are the mechanics, if you like, who create the structures of government, but also hold them to account in different ways. And it's another unique feature of our Constitution. And they've been so valuable. The reactionaries used to say, Black people are not ready for democracy. They're used to being controlled by strong men, belonging to their clan and their community and so on. And of course, they didn't know in the underground, in the Resistu, in Umkhonto, in the other resistance movements, in the trade union movement, in the teachers' organizations, people were cutting across language and even religion and color and so on with these common goals. So democracy in that sense was thriving in the resistance to apartheid. But we wanted to ensure, the reactions used to say, one man, one vote once. Democracy is not for Africa. And ironically, it wasn't for the whites who claimed to be the Democrats. They were anti-democratic. The Black people were democratic. That's my whole experience of my whole life. Since my mother was the typist for Moses Kutani as a child, she'd say, tidy up, Uncle Moses is coming. That idea of democracy, of Ubuntu, of respect, of courtesy, of everybody matters. All of these things were very deep in African culture and society. And so we wanted to have institutions to ensure we would have an independent judiciary. There was a big battle at Kempton Park over that. And I've got to give credit to the Democratic Party at that stage, who resisted the idea of the government of national unity choosing the judges. I was actually approached by Colin Eglin. He wanted to speak urgently to Cyril Ramaphosa on that issue. I was able to arrange that appointment. And Cyril and the others discussed it with all of us and agreed to have an independent Judicial Service Commission. The IEC also absolutely vital for proper elections. We've looked elsewhere in Africa. Look what's happening in the United States with Trump and his challenge to the authority of the elections, how important these bodies are. The Auditor General, amazing. I would say the Auditor General has done more to protect human rights even than the Human Rights Commission, because controlling finance and knowing where the money goes is so important to prevent abuses. So all of these institutions and mechanisms had to be protected by the Constitution to ensure that the processes of choosing government, of choosing the judges, of seeing how money is spent, protecting human rights and so on, the Gender Commission and so on, all of these would be independent hands. You're right. I was one of the first proponents of the Ombudsman. It was based on a visit I paid to Oslo. I just come out of hospital. I go to Norway. I think Norway is a good social democratic country. We can learn a lot about constitutionalism. And I discovered the Constitution plays almost no role at all. They live by conventions. The Constitution was important for the independence from Denmark and from Sweden, but they don't use that in their daily life. And I developed what I call my regicide theory of a Bill of Rights. If you execute the king, you need to concretize sovereignty in a document. If you keep the king going in a constitutional monarchy, then you just have legislation going on and on, deals done between the aristocracy and the new middle class, like England, like the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, and so on. But one thing I saw in Norway that was good was the Ombudsman. But then the comrades here said, what's this Ombudsman? It looks very patriarchal. Ombud, it's a funny term. So we came up with Public Protector. And at that time, it was really a body that would inspect and report to Parliament and leave it to Parliament. And it's interesting that the Constitutional Assembly gave the Public Protector teeth. And I personally feel it was absolutely correct decision to take. And whatever we might think of some of the early public protectors not being strong enough, there's huge admiration for Thuli Madonsela, the present public protector, been highly criticized, the matters before the court, and challenges and possible impeachment. So I won't comment on that at all. But it shows how important it is that government can't simply rely on its own sense of propriety, that you need independent agencies, not just that abstract thing called public opinion and the press, but independent agencies to ensure that government is doing the things that the people in Parliament, in the Constitutional Assembly, the voice of the people, constructed that Constitution. So the Constitution expresses the voice of the people, not a temporary majority in Parliament at one particular time, not a particular president, one person at the time. It was that consolidated vision in the 1996 Constitution, with overwhelming majority after huge deliberations, saying, people of South Africa, these are the rules of the game. These are the fundamental rights that every South African can claim to have. These are the frameworks within which Parliament exercises its powers, the public administration functions, the president exercises his or her powers, the judiciary functions. That is the majority speaking, the majority voice, laying down for future temporary majorities what the fundamental core principles are. And interestingly, it's not only us who's saying that. In Colombia, their constitutional court prevented a president from running for a second or third term with a huge majority to amend the constitution in his favor, getting the requisite 2/3. And they said no. They said something so fundamental as that, you have to go back to something similar to the founding convention that created our constitution, because it's recreating the whole character of our government. The Indian Supreme Court has also come up with ideas of fundamental features. You're not amending the constitution, you're subverting the constitution, you're abnegating the constitution. So it's not just us who are saying that. And that's the answer to the so-called counter-majoritarian argument.
Yes.
What right have the unelected judges got to strike down a law passed by a parliament that's been elected by a majority of the people? It's not only a power, it's a duty. It's a duty envisaged by the constitutional makers, and the constitutional makers weren't Mandela and some business people. The constitutional makers were the people sitting in Cape Town, in the Constitutional Assembly, the ex-political prisoners, the freedom fighters, the women's fighters, the fighters for women's rights, the community organizers. They were in the majority. That's what they said must be binding for the future.
Judge Albie, tell me, and it's one of the questions that we got here, that we've got on the comments, which is there anything with hindsight in the core principles, and maybe in some of the sections of the Constitution which are derived from its own principles, that you feel should have been firmer, more proactive, perhaps, because our society still has not transformed as fundamentally as the Constitution intends. While we wish that there would be gender equality, there isn't. Instead, you do have gender-based violence. And our society, almost whenever given an opportunity to choose leaders, tends to not choose as many women as men, or to choose women. So there is a transformation that is yet to take place in South Africa to reflect the values and the intent of our Constitution. Is there something in our Constitution that you feel perhaps if we'd have been stronger, would have made it easier to legislate and create policy later on?
Okay, the only specific thing I'll come to in a minute, but overwhelmingly, the text of the Constitution, and it was a deliberate, intended text, I think is fantastic. The problem is the non-realization of the possibilities of the text, not the text of the Constitution. It's very progressive, it's very emancipatory. The one structural element that I remember many of us were unhappy with, but we felt we had to live with it, was the provinces and the powers given to the provinces. And our experts on devolution were saying, these middle-ranking provinces are just going to be in the way. They're going to soak up a lot of resources, and what you need is a strong central government and strong local government, but local government in big areas. And that would have been ideal, but there was no way we would get a constitution where the IFP would agree to something like that. They wanted at least a province, KZN, under their control. And there was no way the National Party would agree to that. They assumed that the Western Cape and the Northern Cape would be under their control. So to get a constitution, to get the elections, to move into the democratic era, we all agreed to that. But that's our reality. And to this day, I can't see that the people leading in those provinces, and who knows what might happen in future, would want to change the provincial structures. The one specific area, looking back now, where we could have designed institutions and text is corruption, anti-corruption. And we could have had an anti-corruption body like the IEC, the JSC, an anti-corruption body with extensive powers that right from the beginning could have investigated and had quite a lot of control. That I certainly would have supported. Some people say our electoral system is to blame for the problem.
I was going to ask about that. I'm glad you're going.
Yes, we didn't have any preconceived ideas. We had a workshop in a farm, actually, quite near Stellenbosch, called by the Centre for Development Studies at UWC. And by the way, UWC played a huge role as the engine room of our thinking on the Constitution. Just as Potchefstroom University for the other side, for the liberation movement side, UWC, and there were about 10 of us, almost full time at UWC, working on workshops and ideas, themes. Zola Skuya was there, Ricardo Asmal, Bululan Muka, Yvonne Mujoro, myself, and there were more. And the workshops were conducted by the Center for Development Studies, the ANC Constitutional Committee. We often got support from CALS, Center for Applied Legal Studies, and other groups like that. The ANC sent 2 people from each of the provinces to the workshops. It was a mixture of academia and political activists. And one of them was what kind of electoral system to have. And we got experts from all over the world to come, and local experts who were just technicians. And we looked at first past the post, the English system, the system used in America for the Congress. And we were very worried about that. Single constituencies. We would have had group areas, and the results are very skewed. There's never been a party in England that's had more than 50% of the vote. But with 46%, you can get something like 60% of the seats. And we felt it was very undemocratic. Proportional representation then represents the will of the people. The disadvantage we felt was that the members of parliament are not directly accountable. They're on a list far away. Yes, but we felt the lists had other advantages. It ensured that women would be chosen. In constituencies, it's the strong men who dominate, who are the loudest, the most organized. That patriarchal thing comes in so strongly. I believe that's coming out now quite a lot. You wouldn't get quiet people who are not good on the hustings, rallying the masses, but who know about economics, know about science, know about rights for women. A list enables you to have that. A list enables you to ensure you have people from all the different communities, speaking all the different languages in ways that you can't get so easily from the constituencies. And we didn't want black people voting for black members of parliament, white people for white members of parliament, colored people for colored, and Indian for Indian. That would be perpetuating apartheid. The list encourages going across. So these were all the advantages. On the other hand, we felt the disadvantage of non-accountability. So we softened it by allowing for provincial representation as well as national. And that gave the local provinces quite a big say. But our understanding at that stage was the next elections would be mixed, like in Germany, with constituencies and PR. And unfortunately, that never came to pass. Now it's being discussed. And now, so that's more or less what you have at the local government level in South Africa today, a mixture of wards and PR, so that you end up proportionally represented, but also local accountability. And let's see how it's going to work out in South Africa. I had a very amusing experience, which I'd like to share with your with your viewers. The American embassy were very keen to help. They said to level the playing fields to the Constitutional Committee. I said, please level the playing fields. Please help the regime. We are much stronger than them if you want to level the playing fields. And we were stronger than them. Partly we had to work harder. When you're in power, you don't have to think. You just exercise power. When you're resisting, you have to think. We'd lived everywhere. We'd lived in East Germany and West Germany, everywhere in Africa. We'd lived in Canada and United States and Cuba. We'd seen at first hand. We'd lived the different systems. We'd lived in the People's Republic of Mozambique, in the one-party state in Kenya, in the military-ruled Lesotho, in the Kingdom of Swaziland. We'd seen all the different things. So we were, in that sense, much wiser and much better prepared than the other side. Anyway, so now the Americans saying they can help us with a phone-in from American professors. And there was one professor, I think his name was Ronald Horowitz, very well-known, United States. And this was before we had internet, Zoom, anything like that. So it was all done on the telephone. They couldn't see us. So what Horowitz said is, when you put up these questions to me, I think of what we really need in cases like this. The problem with lawyers is they're always saying on the one hand, on the other hand. Yes. And what we need, he said, is a one-armed lawyer. So,
did they know? Did they know
no,
that? They had no idea.
No, and he couldn't see because it was on the telephone. He couldn't even see. So the ANC Constitutional Committee even had a one-armed lawyer when it came to leveling the playing fields.
Judge Albie, so you get on the bench in the Constitutional Court, and we've had some big cases over the years that have been pivotal. I mean, we had been used to capital punishment for the longest time, firstly, and there remained many people, even in my community back home, who felt strongly that if you take away the death penalty, then, we'll be overwhelmed with crime and so on, and therefore we need to keep the death penalty. That was one issue. But there was also, and you can comment on that, but there was another one, and I'm combining the two because, in a sense, for me, it's when I became aware of the power of a constitution to say your general public opinion, your public sentiment might be one thing, but you can't chop and change the constitution every time people are upset about one or other thing. That's what it said to me in some ways. But there was also the case brought by the Treatment Action Campaign and others, where for the very first time in my life, the court said to the government, no, you are not fulfilling your duties properly. You need to have a proper program to manage the risk for people with HIV and AIDS, to ensure that they've got proper care and treatment. And we want to see it. For me, that was a big moment where I thought, oh, wow. Because I'd grown up in a government that was all powerful. And even when somebody like Robert Sobukwe's sentence has expired, they decided, no, we're going to keep him in jail. There'll be a special clause to keep that guy in jail as long as we want to. Can you just talk us through your own experience in the bench when those kind of cases came through, and maybe what some of your own thoughts at the time were?
Well, thank you for that invitation, because I was going to go there anyhow. I'm remembering now. And our first case, as you say, was capital punishment. And it's a huge moment for me. I hadn't been a judge. Arthur Chaskelson hadn't been a judge. Cato Regan hadn't been a judge. Yvonne Magoro hadn't been a judge. Many of us hadn't been judges before. And now we're sitting up with people like Johan Kriegler, Ismail Mohammed had been a judge for some years, Tolly Madala for a couple of years, Richard Goldstone and others. And it was temporary accommodation then. And this case was so heavy. Capital punishment is so deep. It does something. You are sleepless. It's so profound. And many of us, we defended people who've been sentenced to death. The weight on the shoulder of lawyers. And we'd learned very early on what mattered in relation to your client being what was called a swinger. We used that terrible term, the lawyers, a swinger, death by hanging. What mattered was not the cruelty, the premeditation, the race. If it was white against white, black against black, white against black, no death sentence. Black on white, a swinger. That was number one. Number two, it depended on the judge. And judges like Joseph Herbstein in Cape Town, John Didcott in Durban, never passed a death sentence. We had another judge, I won't mention his name, would do 6 in a year. So it was so arbitrary. And it was really part and parcel of white supremacy. Basically, the death penalty in South Africa was there to keep the blacks in check. Ultimately, that was the big reservoir behind it, that physical power of the state. It went with the beating, the lashing, the whipping, that somehow through physical cruelty, you can make people obedient. And for those of us who'd been in the freedom struggle, and Mandela involved himself when we were sworn in as a judge, he was there. It was marvelous having Mandela in the court when we sworn in. And he said in his opening speech, the last time I was in court was to find out if I was going to be sentenced to death. Today, I inaugurate South Africa's first court on which our democracy depends. So he sent George Bezos to argue against capital punishment, overruling de Klerk, who couldn't imagine a society without capital punishment. And we just felt you can't deal with cruelty by cruelty. We've got to get away from looking for physical control and domination as our mechanism for getting an ordered and decent society. We've got to find other means. And South Africa then had 7 nooses that functioned at a time, cost efficient in Pretoria. And it wasn't controlling crime. It didn't stop the freedom struggle. It just introduced an element of, we think, barbarism in our society. So we unanimously declared the death penalty inconsistent with the humane values of our society. And Yvonne Mokgoro introduced the term Ubuntu into our legal reasoning, that somehow when you kill a fellow human being, whatever they've done, however terrible they've been, you are doing something to the community, to yourself. So there wasn't dancing in the streets, but people respected us for giving principled reasons for our decision. And we said, we listen to what the people say, but we're not a court of public opinion. Then you don't need a constitutional court. You need a constitutional court precisely to protect the dignity of the vulnerable, the marginalized, of the people who are not in political power, of the people who treated as less than being fully human. That's why you need the court. And I must say, there have been calls for return of capital punishment, but never massive mobilization, as you had in many, many other countries. So that was a very important case. It was interesting in court. How do you behave as a judge? And straight away, Ismail Mohammed firing questions, John Didcot firing questions, Arthur Chaskell waiting for his turn, Albie Sachs waiting for his turn. And we developed a mechanism. Yvonne Mokgoro and Kate Regan, they're not pushy, being at the bar, smart ass, witty, combative kind of people. They're thoughtful, creative. And what helped them was getting microphones, because then with a microphone, everybody's voice was equal, equality on the bench. We even arranged no fixed seating. So there's no hierarchy on the Constitutional Court. We changed the seating every term. Only the chief and the deputy chief have fixed seating. A lot of little things like that. That council's eye level is the same eye level as the judges. You're not coming and supplicating, begging justice. You are equal under the Constitution. The whole range of features like that in our Constitutional Court. Other cases, the TAC case wasn't the first one where we instructed government. The first one was Grootboom.
Yes.
Had a very fine, in many ways, housing program, but it didn't take account of people in desperate circumstances who'd been evicted, fire and flood victims, that they had to have temporary accommodation. Mrs. Grootboom did get her temporary accommodation. She actually did win her case. It's wrong to say she got nothing out of it. She didn't get a full RDP home. Sadly, it was only given to her family after she died, but she actually got a temporary accommodation. And Zak Yacoob wrote a brilliant judgment, the foundation of our jurisprudence on social and economic rights. The TAC case was, I still remember it so vividly. The court was packed with people. It was our temporary accommodation, wearing T-shirts saying HIV positive. Men, women, young, old, black, white, brown, totally silent. Arthur Chaskell reading the judgment, and we know it's contradicting what people in the highest positions in the land were thinking about antiretrovirals, saying that if we do enter into the area of policy, which is normally left to the executive and parliament, we do so because the Constitution commands us to do so. The Constitution commands us to uphold fundamental right of access to health. the rights of the child, the rights of women. And in this case, all the evidence showed that the drug nevirapine, which women about to give birth living with HIV could protect their babies about to be unborn, by up to 50%. Now it's about 95% if they take, now it's a cocktail of drugs, and restricting that to only 2 sites in each of the provinces in the formal governmental sector for 2 years while we're gaining experience was unreasonable in terms of our constitution. And we made a declaration. We didn't order the government to provide the vaccines. We just said it is unreasonable, on the understanding if they didn't follow through, then the applicants could come back to court. And what was notable in this case, the TAC consisted of literally tens, hundreds of thousands of people on the ground campaigning, ordinary people living with the virus, saying we want access. It also had very good press publicity and good communications. And then the legal decision was in terms of the Constitution, a country understanding what the issues are. And there's dead silence when Arthur read out the obligations on the part of government. And we went through the curtains at the back, and suddenly there's cheering. And I started crying. I was crying not just because of the impact of HIV. I was crying to feel we have a constitution, and I'm on the court, and we're protecting the rights of the most vulnerable in ways we hadn't even imagined when we wrote that constitution. I was just overwhelmed. It was cry, if you like, of amazement and joy that the law could be used to help people most entitled to get help from the government rather than being subjected to a stingy allocation of resources. So that was a very important case. We had other cases also where maybe there wasn't joy in the streets. The whole question of the rights of homosexual people and bisexual people and so on.
I was going to ask about that just now. Yes, please.
You know, it's of intense concern, not only to the community involved. They were being told that somehow you're not fully human beings.
Yes, yeah.
That there's something tainted in your very existence. It's horrible. It's a total denial of Ubuntu, of humanity, of respect for people being who they are. But it was important not only for members of that community, it's important for South Africa. We come in all shapes and sizes, the right to be different. You don't have to conform. You don't have to be the same. You don't have to be subjected to mainstream culture, tastes, values, opinions. We have a right to be different. We can't use difference for hate, for division, for causing harm, but we can express ourselves in different ways. So there our court again was unanimous, starting off with decriminalizing sodomy, moving on to giving equal rights for the partners of South Africans who married same-sex partners abroad, coming back, equal rights to as if they'd been married, who were in lifelong partnerships. The rights of Kathy Satchwell, a judge, for her partner, a lesbian partner, to get the same benefits that my wife, Vanessa September, can get. There were a whole series of cases ending up with Fourie, the same-sex marriage case. And there, again, the court was unanimous on the principle of inclusion and saying that the Marriage Act, by not targeting same-sex couples, by rendering them invisible, not giving them access to express their love and their fidelity and incur their responsibilities in the same way heterosexual couples could do, was a profound denial of their right to be human beings, of their privacy rights, of their dignity rights, and above all of their equality rights. So we made that very, very, very clear. Now, again, one of the strategies we used was to send the matter to Parliament to debate the issue, not to decide whether same-sex couples could marry, but how it could be done legislatively. And the objective of doing that was to get a national debate going and to get Parliament to undertake its responsibilities. It's not just the judges to point the finger and say, naughty, naughty, this has got to be done. Parliament should undertake and shoulder its responsibilities, and Parliament did so in the Civil Unions Act that was already before Parliament, allowing same-sex couples to say, I marry you. The M word was vital, I marry you. And now South Africa has got quite accustomed to same-sex marriages, and you see in the social pages the gossip about same-sex couples that split and the reasons for the divorce and breakdown and so on. It's a rather dire form of equality that's been achieved, equality of gossip. But there were a couple of areas where we didn't get unanimity, and I was actually in the minority. The one was on the right of the Rastafaris. People to smoke.
Yes.
And the court split 5-4 against carving out a religious exemption. But years later, much more recently, the court has in effect decriminalized the possession and smoking. So it took a little time maybe for the majority to catch up in that respect. And the other area we couldn't agree on was in relation to sex work. I don't think any of us like the idea of sex for pay and brothels and so on. It's not supporting that, but acknowledging that these things are part of our reality and bringing the criminal law in leads to so many dire consequences to health and abuse of women and so on. Decriminalization is the way to go. And maybe all my colleagues would have agreed with that, but the majority felt that's not for us on the court to decide. That's for Parliament to decide. And it didn't involve fundamental rights. Some of us felt very strongly the fundamental right involved in that case was the fact that it was only the men who'd be prosecuted. There was a gender dimension in the Sex Offences Act. Even though it didn't say so in practice, it was understood the prostitute would be a woman and she would be subject to penalization. And the man who's paying for it gets off scot-free, even though technically he can be prosecuted. And if you have a man who's a prostitute, you call him a male prostitute, the term prostitute. And we couldn't get agreement across the board on that particular one.
Judge Albie, we're going towards the end now, but the first question I have for you as we close is that I sometimes wonder whether we have internalized sufficiently and across the different sectors of our population and our society, that ultimately it's less about what the judges say and what the legislators say. And when I say it, I mean the transformation into the ideal society that we want. And it also needs to be more about what we demand and insist on of ourselves, of our community structures, of our families, of our public institutions, and the people we entrust with leadership. I have had a lingering concern over the years that in some ways, by litigating with all of the political litigation we've had and the independence of our courts and the strength of our constitution have also unhelpfully cultivated a culture of apathy where we say you can always engage in lawfare and ask the judges to decide. And I've been concerned about, in a way, it could lead to unwarranted resentment, because in our architecture, there is supposed to be a balance between what we as citizens do, what the government does, and what the judiciary comes in occasionally to resolve some of these issues. What is your comment on that, Judge Albie?
It's one of total agreement. I wouldn't detract from the work the court's doing at all. It's not to have less what's called lawfare. We must have it. It's robust. The issues are out there in the open. The court's the ultimate arbiter on all sorts of tricky issues. and that part of a vibrant democracy. And I think the court has saved us in South Africa, and in effect, in impact, enabled us to have the inquiries that have resulted in the exposure of all the corruption and the bad things that have been happening. So it's not to diminish the role of the courts at all, but I wish we had less talk of delivery. Service delivery, to my mind, is just the wrong notion. It's the state having resources which it dishes out to the people. The people are waiting for it, and they get cross when they're not getting enough. They get cross with total justification when there's corruption and wastage. But that's the wrong relationship. It's a passive recipient, gorging, if you like, dependent public community. And it's not, I was so moved after the terrible rogue behavior and mayhem in July, the way the communities responded, coming to the fore, protecting their malls, sweeping up, expressing their opinions. We hadn't had anything like that for decades. And we need more of that, much more of that. So that's not to diminish the importance of institutions and the judiciary in particular. I'm so proud of our judges now. And they're being attacked from many different sides and being told that they've been captured, and they are independent and they can see the truth, they tell the truth as they see it. It resonates, it rings true. So that's not to be undermined at all. But we do need much more active communities. We need strong parents associations involved and engaged with the schools. We need the branches of our huge trade union movement to be involved not just in wages, working conditions, of course they're important, but also in designing curricula, in designing new forms of control of production, in coming up with ideas. We need in the struggle days, we really had to be close to the communities all the time, to be hidden by them, to get them to speak out, to overcome their fear of oppression, to educate their children. The communities played such a big role in our struggle, and one really looks forward to the communities in that sense being revitalized and being more active. I think the idea that the Constitutional Court had of allowing independents to run for office was motivated by that. It remains to be seen if that will make a difference. But I support very, very strongly the points that you're making. The faith communities, of course, also they played a big role in the struggle as well. And they have a big role to play, not simply in enabling people in accordance with their faith to get into paradise or to have a wonderful funeral when they pass, but also to have life here on earth, to engage as human beings with passion, with dignity, with erudition, with compassion.
Just one last thing, Judge Albie. What would your message be to the much younger part of our population, who do not have the first-hand memory of all of these things we have been talking about? I consider myself very fortunate. I was a teenager in the 1990s, so I can remember. I couldn't participate in some of the things, but I can remember a lot of this. And in a world where we're bombarded with information, with misinformation, with history being told and retold in many, many distorted ways that people run with. And yet we want to build a democracy that is built to be participatory in its core as far as possible and consultative and so on. What would be your message to South Africans who are young about our constitution and our future?
Well, there are immediate sources that people can go to. And I'm thinking now of the Constitutional Hill Trust, We've developed online museum, an online archive of the whole constitution-making process, going back to Semi in 1906, saying that we need a constitution in South Africa, he was studying in America, that idea, bringing it up to date. A lot of the themes that I've been mentioning are on this discussion. And we do it with multiple voices. It's not just the voice of Albie Sachs or from one particular position. We've even made a great little animation for people with a shorter attention span. Maybe I can get the information to you. You can send it out to your viewers. And it was fun, and it was amazing. How do you tell this whole story in 4-5 2-minute episodes? And what's the place of people like Robert Sobukwe and Steve Biko, the mainstream people and the unions and others? How do they all come in? So that's also accessible. And there's a book coming out, it'll be early next year, based on the work that was done by Oliver Tambo, setting up a constitutional committee, working with Paulo Jordan, Zola Skouya, Professor Jack Simons, I was there, Kada Asmal, Bridget Mpandla, Teddy Pakani, Penel Maduna, and others, laying the foundations of our constitution. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of a lot of principles developed in the course of what we saw as our revolutionary struggle for transformation. And it's an amazing book, interesting, of Oliver Tambo flying in a little Cessna plane from one African country to the other to bring them on board with a document called the Harare Declaration, which really laid down the framework for our whole constitutional program, hardly known in South Africa. And he had a stroke immediately afterwards, and we had to carry on, even although Comrade O.R. was semi-paralyzed at that stage. It's a very, very dramatic story, intellectually interesting story. Professor Andre Odendaal, who wrote the book, The Founders, on the black communities establishing the ANC from the 1890s up till early 20th century. He's been looking at all the documents, the papers, interviewing people and so on. So we're bringing out lots of materials. Then people can make up their own minds, but at least have an idea. And I think they will feel a great sense of pride in what our ancestors did. I have to think, who are my ancestors? And I've got my ancestors. My ancestors were people like Albert Luthuli and Moses Kotane, and they're not ancestors quite in that same sense. J.B. Marx, we even used to sing, volunteers obey the orders, Dr. Maroka, Dr. Dadu, J.B. Marx, Kotane Lebapapi, volunteers obey the orders, be ready for the action now. Anyway, some of those names are my ancestors. And it's a good story, and it's a story of African ability, intellect, sociability, reaching out, tapping deep into traditional African culture, but also going to the whole world, for ideas and values and so on. All of these things are captured in that book. So let me send you some references to materials that are already available, and other materials, and lots more things are being produced. We're working on a book now on 25 cases in the Constitutional Court, strong cases. It's not a legal textbook. It's a book for the general public.
Yes.
What are the issues? How did people feel, respond? Capital punishment, treatment action campaign, other cases as well, the destruction of the Scorpions, the Kandla, overpayment on security, but not only the politically oriented cases, and not even only the socially oriented cases, other cases, rights for workers, very important cases giving the workers on the mines who suffered from silicosis the right to class action. Huge payments. direct benefit coming from the road of the courts. All of these will be included in that book.
Judge Albie, thank you so much. I want to thank you, firstly, for being available today and being so patient and generous with your time to talk to us and to talk to South Africans. And because there'll be a recording, this will be watched by many, by multitudes of people into the future. And certainly we'll send you a link. The second thing is I want to say that I'm really grateful, and I'm sure I speak for many people, to be grateful for your contribution to our country, for your sacrifice, and for continuing to serve our country in the manner in which you do. You really are a fine example, and you make some of us feel embarrassed that we are not doing more. And I want to say that I am really grateful, and all of us are really grateful for your service, Judge Albie. I don't know if Pumeza wants to say a few words. I just want to say from my perspective, I want to thank the fellows at Brand South Africa for insisting that we do this. And I have certainly enjoyed the history, your perspectives, your wisdom, Judge Albie. It's wonderful. It's a treasure to our country, and these platforms allow us to keep these things for posterity, and it will be seen for many years to come. And thank you to you.